versus SMU. And we talked about this off camera too, but at least in my eyes, I think this is the most unpredictable game in my opinion. Not so much that I'm going to argue that SMU is a better team than Penn State, because I think Penn State's a more talented team, but it's when you think about those big games, those lack of success that James Franklin's had in those big games, and then when I look at a team like SMU who almost came back and won the ACC championship for Clemson, I just think this is a team you can't underestimate. And quite frankly, I've spent too much on this time on this show underestimating SMU, so I don't want to do that this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a thought that just kind of popped into my head here is you look at both of these teams, and I think a lot of people have questions about each team, and that question would be, who have they beaten? I mean, I think SMU, that's one of the reasons that a lot of people were saying they should have been left out of the playoff. I'm happy they got in. I feel like they deserved it. But when you look at their schedule, there's not a lot of extremely impressive wins on there. And then you look at Penn State too, and I mean, they did exactly what they typically do. I mean, they're in Ohio State not losing to Michigan away from just missing the Big Ten championship game with 2 losses, just like always, right? Because they're always the bridesmaid, but never the bride at Penn State. It feels like so. Obviously, they got into that Big Ten championship game, and I thought it was one of their best performances offensively, especially of the season. And I think there should be some optimism in Penn State, but I do feel like this could go sideways. I'm not saying it will, and I'll get more into it, but just kind of want to get your take there.
Yeah, and I guess the other question too is you sit there and say to yourself, who has more pressure, Ryan Day or James Franklin? Because in many ways they both have the same exact problems, but at the same time, you sit there and say to yourself that these two are picture made for these jobs too. I mean, James Franklin is a great example for Penn State. He understands how to recruit. He hires solid coordinators all the time. He brought in Tom Allen, who coached in Indiana, to be his DC, and he's done a phenomenal job. And then you look at Andy Kowanicki, who is innovative. He's creative. He spent last year under Lance Leopold's staff at Kansas. But the thing that I question about Penn State, again, it's not Drew Aller. They're getting Nick Singleton more involved, but it's how can they be more creative? Because I think a lot of times you sit there and say to yourself, man, they're just getting going way too late into games, and they're just coming out flat. And especially the more and more you get into these games, you just can't afford to come out flat. And that's exactly what happened in the Big Ten championship game when they played Oregon. Oregon got on the gas and never let up.
Yeah, I do feel like that's something I have noticed over these years of watching the James Franklin teams. It seems like when they get in these big games, they oversimplify, and it's good to an extent to maybe simplify your playbook a little bit. But I feel like you're, and I get this a lot talking to Penn State fans. It's frustrating because you feel like you're running the same, 4 or 5 plays over and over again. So I do agree there. I think they need to get creative. And then, I think an interesting thing is here. I feel like, and this might seem like an obvious statement, but I feel like the closer this game is, the later we get into the game, the more it favors SMU. I feel like if Penn State comes out slow, and SMU comes out, playing well, and maybe hits them with a left hook, maybe we got a game here. I mean, I think SMU, one of the reasons they lost the ACC championship is they got off to a slow start. They played very well in the second half. Obviously, it wasn't quite enough. I feel like if they get off to a faster start in that game, they probably win. And I think if they get off to a fast start in this game, it gives them a really good chance to win. And I think if Penn State gets off to a really fast start, I think this one is all about who gets off to that fast start. Because that stadium's going to be rocking. We went there for a game last year, and it is electric. So I'm imagining what it's going to be like for that first playoff game with the whiteout atmosphere. But if SMU, but it doesn't help you if your team can't score, right? If Penn State comes out and lays an egg and they get down 14-0, 10-0, then what happens?
Exactly, because I mean, I go back and think about the Minnesota game a couple weeks ago, because Minnesota is a quality team too. I mean, they beat USC this year. They've beaten a couple quality teams this year, and you just can't. It's just not going to work anymore. So to me, that's kind of one of those big questions too. And especially when you have a guy like Kevin Jennings, who is a dual threat quarterback, can extend plays outside of the pocket. One of the big questions I ask myself too is, we've talked about how great those edge rushers are between, Abdul Carter. He's absolutely phenomenal to watch too. So my other question too is, to what extent can Penn State's defensive line contain Kevin Jennings, and also how how much will Penn State's wide receivers play an impact in this game? Because the reality is that they, quite frankly, have not done enough to really be factors in this game. And I think at times it leaves you Allard and an island to be able to create something out of nothing at times. I mean, you go back and you look at I think the Ohio State game is a great example of what can happen when you have tough physical corners who can stuff you and not give you much room to do anything.
Yeah, but do you feel like with the cold weather forecasted for this game, maybe this turns into more of a running game? And if that's the case, do you favor Penn State physically over SMU if this game is going to be won and lost in the trenches? Who do you favor Penn State?
I mean, SMU is a top 15 offense too. I mean, they've averaged well over 400 yards a game, and they've done it both passing the ball and running the ball. So I don't think it's necessarily an advantage for Penn State, but I would also say that when you have a healthy guy like Nick Singleton, he's been injured, he's been on and off in terms of injuries. And then he came back for the Maryland game. That was a nice tune-up game for him. And I really liked how much they utilized him in the Oregon game, particularly in the passing game. I would definitely anticipate seeing them do more of that in terms of this SMU game too. But I would argue that I think it helps both of them really, because I don't think either of these teams really depend on running the ball as much necessarily.
Yeah, and just the way you've been talking, I'm fascinated to hear your pick here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick Penn State. Again, I think there is a path for SMU to win the game, and not to be boring and pick all the home teams here, 4-for-4 picking the home teams. But I am going to go Penn State in this game. I think they get the job done. I just think it could be interesting. It could be an interesting game, and I'm definitely excited to see the atmosphere down there at the stadium.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been itching to see Penn State in this sort of environment for such a long time, because you sit there and say to yourself, you give yourself almost too much hope when they were in the Big Ten championship game, and then they play Ohio State, and obviously last year versus Michigan too. But I'm going to reluctantly agree with you and say Penn State, but I also ask myself too, I would not be surprised if we're having the same conversation next week in terms of SMU maybe getting off to a 10, 14-point lead, James Franklin making some adjustments in the second half and being able to just slightly be able to pull away with it too. But at the same time, I at least in my opinion, if you ask me which team is the most likely to which lower seed is going to be able to pull off the victory, I would argue SMU has the best chance out of all of them.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a good take. I've gone back and forth on this. I'm pretty confident that Penn State will win the game, but I feel like I don't know. Maybe that Clemson Texas game, man. I don't know. I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see how that one gets off to how that one starts, and then I think the Indiana Notre Dame game is going to be obviously an exciting game. But I feel pretty confident about Notre Dame and that, and then the Ohio State Tennessee game. I feel like that one's another one where I could see it going Tennessee's way, but like we talked at the top of the show, like Ohio State is the most talented team in the country. So if they just show up, don't get in their own way, I think they should win that game.
Exactly, and I think a lot of all these teams obviously deserve to be in too. But it could be, especially going into next week, you sit there and say this could be the week where some of these games are more competitive, and then you look at on paper, for example, and say, could Texas versus Arizona State could that game get out of hand, for example. But I think all four of these games are going to be a lot of fun to watch. And Jeff, I appreciate you being there for your time and coming on.
Yeah, no, and just kind of closing point, I feel like it's been the perfect season for a 12-team playoff, right? Like, I think you look up and down at these 12 teams, and they all have flaws. There's no like perfect teams. I think with NIL, I think you're seeing that your top team in today's college football probably wouldn't have matched up with your top teams even a few years ago. I think the talent spread out, but I think it provides some exciting matchups, and there's definitely some intrigue, and excited to see it all play out.
Yeah, and it's also just nice to not have too much controversy for this one too. I think it always helps too.
Yeah, and again, thank you for having me on the show. Definitely enjoyed breaking down these games with you, and looking forward to breaking down, watching them together and then breaking down future matchups.